Hey there, listeners. This is Terry Cowley, your host of the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. Thanks so much for being here and welcome to Season 3. Hello, I'm here with my fellow Outback Associate Editor Ken Eastwood, and he actually had an international assignment in Indonesia in relation to the cattle industry recently. It's very much fresh, and rather than me try and encapsulate his experience and the story he's going to write, I'll let Ken explain to you, and then we'll hear all about the amazing experience that he did have over there. So, welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Terry. Good to be here again. And yes, back from Indonesia. It's a long time since I've done any sort of journalism assignment overseas, so it's pretty exciting to go to Indonesia. And the whole point was, I guess, to follow what happens to Australia's cattle when it arrives in Indonesia. So I wasn't necessarily looking so much at loading on this end, and because we've done many stories on that before. I was looking at our cattle from the time they arrive at port in Indonesia right through to the table.
And this, of course, will be a story for the upcoming issue, so you haven't written it yet. And perhaps this conversation is a little bit of your thought process, a bit of a brain dump after coming back from this very amazing experience.
Very much so. Yeah, I think as journos, we end up with all this information, and it's often way too much, and it's how do we distill that down to something that's going to be meaningful for the reader and provide information, but also not read like an encyclopedia entry.
So you flew in and you're basically meeting the cattle coming off the boat.
Yes, so flew into Jakarta, and as you know, that's a very, very big city. In fact, the island of Java, I think, is the most populous island in the world. So Indonesia now, I think, is sitting around 280, 290 million people. And Java and that Jakarta area, I think the Jakarta area has something like 30 million people. So for us in Australia, it's an incredible experience to arrive with sort of the noise and just the people everywhere. You think of all of Australia's population and more in one sort of little area. But most of the feedlots are actually across in the island of Sumatra. So if you can picture Indonesia, you've got Java, and then just to the northwest is the island of Sumatra. Down in the lower southeast of Sumatra is where the bulk of the 28 feedlots are, and I was visiting CPC's feedlots, and they have one that can have about up to about 25,000 cattle at any time.
So most of the feedlots are the same size?
No, CPC is the largest. The feedlots range from about 1,000 up to about 22,000, up to that 25,000.
Is there a reason why they're all in that location?
I think it's access to ports and it's access to the markets. CPC also has another feedlot called Medan up in the northern part of Sumatra. That's a much smaller feedlot. CPC is the biggest, and CPC also have the whole chain. So some other companies, for example, and CPC also exports cattle to other feedlots, so not just to their own feedlots. So they're exporting around 100,000 cattle a year, and their own feedlots will be looking after about 60,000. The whole trade last year of cattle to Indonesia was 540,000. This year is quite interesting. For whatever reason, the Indonesian government has only issued permits at this stage for 350,000, which is a considerable decrease, but all the people who are in the know believe that more permits will be issued later this year.
And why were they restricted?
It's an interesting question. I think when we're talking about politics and Indonesia, things get quite tricky. The whole trade is often very much based on meeting people and building up trust. So there is some elements of mystery around why this has occurred. And I think people in the industry are working on trying to solve that problem, because obviously it creates uncertainty for many people in the industry right back here in Australia. Are we sending 350,000 cattle this year, or are we sending 540,000 or even more? most people seem to believe that the industry should stabilise around 600,000, but we haven't hit that number for a few years.
Okay, obviously politics comes into play when you're talking about foreign relations, but presumably Indonesians need that protein, don't they? So surely that's a massive driving factor as well.
Very much so. So we have a growing demand in Indonesia for protein, and in particular beef. It's still very low numbers compared to the amount of beef that we eat here in Australia. So the average per capita consumption of beef in Indonesia is only around 2.5 kilos per person per year. And that is very, very widely variable. So in capital cities, that could be 6 times that amount. In remote villages such around the feedlot, it'll be considerably less than that. So
or nothing.
That's right. So the average wage the minimum wage in Indonesia, which many, many rural people, of course, are subject to, is around $300 a month. That's 300 Australian a month. So you can imagine with that sort of income, many forms of protein, such as beef, are going to be a luxury.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I saw some of your photos from the trip at the market with some of the prices. It's really expensive.
Yes, particularly. So we also export to Indonesia a lot of boxed beef, a lot of chilled beef, and a lot of frozen beef. The prices for that in the supermarket, like we were looking at $60 a kilo pieces of steak and that sort of thing. So you can imagine that that sort of thing is completely out of the question for the bulk of people in Indonesia. However, the expats and the wealthy people are sort of turning to these. And I saw in the supermarket there was also beef from America, there was beef from New Zealand. In terms of live export, Australia is the only supplier of live export cattle to Indonesia at the moment. There are some moves from Brazil to sort of move in on that territory, which would be interesting because from Brazil, it'd be, let's say, a 20-day trip to get to Indonesia as opposed to the 3, 4, 5 days it is from the Australian ports. And whether or not they can do it for cheaper and be competitive, that's, I guess, up to Brazil and Indonesia.
Now, you would know a lot more about this, so correct me if I'm not right. But the whole point of live export is so that, well, there's probably many reasons for it, but one of the reasons is so the animals can be killed in a certain way. Did you observe that part of the operation?
Yes, there are many reasons for our live export trade. As you mentioned before, that there is a growing demand for beef in Indonesia, and they just do not have the cattle numbers to be able to supply that trade. They have about 14 million.
Or the land to even raise them.
And so grazing, as we perceive it, doesn't happen in Indonesia. Many people have in their backyard 1 or 2 animals. If they might be goats, they might be sheep, or they could be cattle. And that for them is their bank. So they see that as, instead of putting your money under the mattress or into a banking facility, you save up and you buy a cow. And then when you have a wedding or a funeral or a big event or a celebration, you can either choose to bank that cow or use it in those sorts of ways. So there are, the cattle that are there are generally they're kept with nose rings. They're in people's backyards or in tiny little sheds. It's not how we perceive cattle being cared for and looked after. Now, you mentioned halal killing, and that obviously is a very, very big thing. You know, most people in Indonesia are Muslim or leaning towards Muslim philosophy and religion. So therefore, they require their meat to be killed in particular ways. And generally that is one slash across the throat. It can't be multiple slashes. It has to be all done in one slash with a very sharp knife. There's a prayer said beforehand, that sort of thing. Since the big outbreak of concern and the temporary banning of live export from Australia in 2011, after that hideous footage came out, the majority of cattle in Indonesia that are live export are now stunned first. So they're given they are stunned and made unconscious before that act. And that required imams and a whole bunch of people to actually approve that process, to say, yes, we're going to say that this is still halal. Out of the 38 provinces in Indonesia, there are 2 that currently don't have stunning facilities, so they are very much in the minority. And we've even found, I was chatting to many of the vets and the animal welfare workers over in Indonesia, and since the changes to Australia's cattle in Indonesia from 2011, many of the domestic cattle now, when they are killed, are also stunned. So it's actually led a very, what I believe is a very, very positive change across the whole country.
So going back to coming off the boat, are they trucked to the feedlot? Is there a long way from the boat to the feedlot?
Good question. So it's very, very different. If you ever see a boat getting loaded up in Darwin or up Port Hedland or wherever else, you see road trains of 3 or 4 full carriages. So we're talking about 180 cattle coming in, 6 decks, that sort of thing. Over in Indonesia, there's nothing like that. So they're all put on.
I guess the trucks would be smaller.
Oh, very much smaller. We're talking about average of, say, 10 to 15 head per truck, and it's a very, very clever offloading ramp that has 3 different trucks can access it at a time, so they can just keep these trucks coming into 3 different points, and they just keep diverting them, either this one, or this one. It still takes a long period of time, so I think the 2,700 that I saw getting offloaded, it would have been a total of about 10 hours to get them off.
Wow. Just as your mind gets kind of blown, or our minds get blown going somewhere like Java, it's the mass of humanity and so many people. I mean, to have these guys, and I know this has happened in education sharing between the 2 countries, to have some of these guys to come over here and see how our industry works with our B doubles and our massive stations, that would completely blow their minds, wouldn't it?
Oh, very much so. And a lot of the workers at CPC, at the feedlots there, have actually come to Australia and had that experience, particularly the managers. They've come to see, they've worked on some of the stations like Carlton Hill or Newcastle Waters, and so they've seen the entire process. From the port, it's about an hour by truck to the feedlot, so not that far. I was surprised. I assumed that on the 4 days coming over on the boat, I assumed that the cattle would lose a bit of condition, but it's quite a mix. Some of the individuals might have lost 1 to 2% of their weight, and others might have gained 2 or 3%. So it's really quite dependent on the individual. But you compare that, say, to cattle getting trucked for, say, 3 or 4 days across Australia, where they might lose 10% of their body weight. It's actually, in some ways, it's a better equation.
So what sort of figures are they planning on? So with the amount of cattle that they're shipping in, how much do they expect to lose on the way?
Mortality rates are incredibly low, and I think, again, this has been a major positive change in the industry over the past 10, 15 years, a real awareness of how do we keep mortality rates to as low as possible. For example, on this vessel, 2000, so this was the Devon Express, 2,700 head getting unloaded. It will be recorded as 0 mortalities, but as the vessel was arriving into port, one of the heavier bulls, I think, jumped on another cattle and actually broke its back, which means that they had to put one down in the port. But I think that that is still recorded as a 0 mortality, but certainly that was dealt with at the time when I was there.
So just before we move on to land with the cattle, this is a little bit of a red herring in the equation, but sheep, are we exporting sheep, live export, to Indonesia?
Not to Indonesia. So our live export sheep, and as many of our listeners would know, so that trade is due to finish in 2028. And although the coalition has said they will endeavour to wind back that legislation, some experts believe that the legislation has been written so it can't be wound back. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in that space. But generally, the industry has been given money to exit the sheep industry.
Yeah, doesn't seem like a whole heap of money, 130 million or something. But anyway, was there any discussion about that matter?
Yeah, I think people in the live export industry, whether in Indonesia or whether here, are well aware that things could happen that could change on the flip of a coin, such as happened in 2011. There are still many people in Indonesia who are very emotionally distressed about when things were stopped in 2011. And although it was only temporary, many people did lose their businesses or their jobs and that sort of thing.
It was literally overnight, wasn't it?
Yes. It took a few days to get the legislation through, but yes.
It would have been such a shock.
Exactly right. And I think because very much their way of doing trade is based on this, on trust, and it's quite different to our Western thought. I can't even really express it, but there was a breach of that trust, and there are still people who are quite emotionally worked up about it 14 years down the track.
I'm sure they understand it wasn't the people they had relationships with that were responsible for that.
Yes. And look, and I'm well aware too that many of our listeners up in the north who were affected by that are also very emotional about it still too. And as we know, there have been ongoing court cases.
But from what I'm hearing from you, you believe it was a shock, but it has brought about positive changes.
I believe so. And look, I had the horrible morning the other week just looking at all the footage again from 2011 that came out that led to that temporary stop of live export. And look, it was terrible footage. Those sorts of things really shouldn't happen. And if those things have been tightened up, and I believe they have, and many positive changes have been made, such as the stunning of cattle before killing, that sort of thing, I think it's only a good thing. For those of us who eat meat, I think we need to continue to wrestle with these processes and be happy all the time that, yes, we believe to the best of our ability that cattle are being treated humanely and that things are going as they should. There will always be, I think, in any industry, rogue operators and people who are caught doing the wrong thing. But our job, I think, as consumers is to continue to ensure that the highest possible standards are maintained.
And of course that goes for the egg industry, the chicken industry, everything.
Exactly right. Or even crops, I want the highest possible standards maintained with cropping.
Yeah, and I guess that extends to how we treat people as well.
Very much so. And I was delighted at CPC that there are many programs in place to make sure that the workers there are treated very well. So, for example, I mentioned, the $300 a month wage that is the minimum wage at feedlots there. They are paid 50% above that. They are given free medical care for themselves and for their families. Through COVID, they were very much looked after, with individuals being given private care in hospitals and in hotels and things. Like, it really was a company that, and I believe it is a company that endeavours to look after its people and the people actually around the feedlot. So for 10 kilometres around the feedlot, they offer free vaccinations to cattle. Now, this is good for CPC because it ensures that any foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease isn't within that area, but it's also providing a free service to people within 10 kilometres of the feedlot. It's interesting, however, about 50% of locals do not take up the offer. They, for whatever reason, whether they're afraid of needles for their cattle or whether they just don't perceive that there's a problem, only about 50% take up that offer.
So getting back to the feedlot, you mentioned in a previous discussion about how you had to completely almost be fumigated on the way in and out of the feedlot and change your clothes completely. Tell me about that experience.
Yes, so biosecurity is very, very high. So you're met at the gate by a security guard with lock gates, and that's cattle trucks, that's everything. People going to the office, everybody is met in that way. The vehicles are completely hosed down and then treated with a chemical. And meanwhile, the people who are going to be entering the feedlot have to exit the vehicles, go through a changing facility, and it's quite interesting because you take off everything and then you walk through a chemical bath that's actually in the change room with you, and on the other side of the chemical bath is a whole set of new clothes. You get out into those clothes, you come out, you're given fresh gumboots, then you walk through another chemical bath, and then you are free to actually go into the feedlot. Now, when the midday prayers come, so the people are called back to the mosque, and there is a mosque on site, they have to go back through that facility in order to get to the mosque, and then after their lunch, they will return back through that.
So you mentioned a couple of diseases there, those 2 diseases. Is that really what's the main concern?
They are the main concerns, and they are in Indonesia at the moment. And even me sort of coming back to Australia, I was very conscious of declaring everything and making sure I completely scrubbed my boots again when I got home, all those sorts of things, because the last thing we want is any spreading of that anywhere. There are a few other diseases. They're also watching that there's a respiratory infection as well, but they're the main 2. So
yes, I do recall when you're coming into Australia, you fill out those cards and it specifically asks if you've been onto, I guess, or mixing with livestock, etc. You didn't have any issues coming back in?
No, not this time, which was good because I hadn't slept in about 30 hours or something, so it was nice to actually get through fairly easily.
Fair enough. So tell me about the experience actually on the feedlot. So you go through all that rigmarole, shall we say. Then what do? You're just walking around looking at cattle? Was that the experience?
Yeah, so anybody who hasn't been to a feedlot or hasn't seen a feedlot, it's a very different experience to what we often see in Australia. We're grazing cattle, and I spend a lot of time on cattle stations and on properties looking at cattle. So to be in a feedlot is different. The thing that surprised me more than anything, Terry, was they were so quiet. I expected there to be a bit of jostling amongst the cattle and a bit of, lowing and mooing, but they were just so calm. They're munching away. They're fed 4 times a day with this wonderful mix. It actually smells really nice because it's got molasses in it, so it smells quite sweet. And it's got a few things like tapioca chips, and it's got corn, and there's about 9 ingredients.
Just on that feed, is that all local produce?
Yes, so generated locally, and there were just trucks every day coming in. They get a lot of green, they call it green chop there, so people might harvest their corn much earlier, and they'll actually chop up the entire plant and give that to the cattle rather than waiting for the actual corn kernels to fully mature.
Right. That must be a bit of a boon to local producers having to come up with all that feed.
Yeah, very much so. And so I spent a lot of time with various producers who have grown their businesses exponentially as a result of the feedlot being there and other feedlots. So, I was focused on CPC's operation, but I'm well aware that there are other feedlots that many of these suppliers also supply. And the cattle, as I said, 4 times a day, they're putting on almost 2 kilograms a day, Terry, which is a very high rate. And I think to me that shows these cattle are not being hassled, that they're not losing weight because they're stressed. They're actually putting on that much weight a day.
I mean, that sort of sense of calm is a deliberately created thing, isn't it?
Very much so. The Indonesian workers are known for their calmness. Didn't see people, poking and prodding and yelling. And they have to be trained, obviously, to deal with Brahmin.
So they're mainly Brahmin?
Real mix of things. And CPC in particular, many listeners might know that CPC has been introducing black cattle to the north. So now there's a real mix of Brahmin, red cattle, crossbreeds, black cattle. The bulk would be the Bos Indicus, the Brahmin cross.
Okay, so the cattle are fed 4 times a day. Is there room for them to move around when they're not feeding? What happens at other times?
The feed is sort of almost always available. They're in pens of about 120 each, and they can move around those pens, but they're not given wide roam to go and walk hills or anything.
No, you don't want to burn up too many calories.
That's right. They have a coconut husk base to their pens, and that is changed every few days. And then, of course, a feedlot like that that's got 60,000 cattle over the year has to work out what do we do with all this manure and this combination of coconut husk and manure. It's actually really, really good fertilizer, and they are growing many of the ingredients themselves. So they have their own cornfields and all that sort of thing. but they've got way too much. So they're actually giving away many of that also to their suppliers.
Okay, so they're how long in the feedlot?
Generally, we're looking at about 90 days. So trying to get the cattle up to about 500 kilos. They can be sent for slaughter earlier than that. And a lot there depends too on major festivals. Sometimes some will be sent to the slaughterhouse before they reach that 500 kilogram mark.
And where is the abattoir?
So there are a real mix of abattoirs. And again, part of this is, and this is where we wrestle with this thing of live export. Well, why live export? Why haven't we exported from Australia as box beef or chilled beef, that sort of thing?
Which we are doing.
And price is one factor, but the other is the bulk of beef in Indonesia is actually sold in what we call wet markets or traditional markets. And so that is beef that is very freshly killed. So in the example that I went to see, so the cattle were killed at midnight and they were in the wet markets by about 2 a.m. And certainly by 7 o'clock in the morning, that meat was sold. But that was only 2 or 3 head in that particular store. And the whole beast is sold. So they have a lot of use for things like stomach and lung and various things that we probably turn our nose up here at a bit, but they have particular soups and things that are very popular. So for me, going into a wet market, I hadn't actually done that before. And so, you've got hoofs hanging down and a stomach over here and then a piece of sirloin there, and it's all hanging. It's not refrigerated, and it's all sold within a few hours after killing, and cooked that day, and then eaten that day.
Yeah, and that's very much to do with lack of refrigeration.
That's definitely part of the reason, but I poked into that a bit because many people do have refrigerators now. So I kept saying, well, why then the need to have it? So much of it is actually cultural now.
Yeah, that's what they've always done. And I mean, environmentally, in terms of not having to refrigerate your meat, having it that fresh and also using the whole animal, it's much more sustainable, isn't it?
Yes, exactly right, compared to throwing out things. I mean, obviously in Australia, there are other uses for those cuts, and we have various side chains like pet food and all sorts of things, probably sausages in some cases. But yes, to eat head to tail is a much more sustainable way of dealing with, and all this effort goes into creating an animal to eat. So yes, to be able to eat the whole thing, I think it is a great way to go.
So you went to the abattoir?
I was given free access to the abattoirs. I didn't actually see any killing, partly because our schedule had to change because the boat came in 12 hours late. So the appointment I had to watch the whole killing process didn't occur. So I was disappointed at that, but these things happen. When you're on assignment, you go with the flow, and I just wasn't able to actually be there while cattle were killed, but I was given access to the abattoirs.
Now, you mentioned in an earlier conversation a dairy project.
That's right. And again, we look at the political situation in Indonesia and how Australia can continue to support Indonesia so that this trade continues as much as possible. And one of the things that the current president of Indonesia is trying to do is, it's almost like the scheme that I had when I was a kid, and I think maybe when you were a kid as well, Terry, where we were given milk and it was compulsory. You had to drink your milk. It actually, I remember this milk sitting in the sun for hours before we got to eat it, and it had half curdled.
Not my best school memories.
It almost put me off milk. But the president has realised that there are 90 million children in Indonesia who need good nutrition and perhaps aren't getting. So his idea of providing a hot meal or a nutritious meal and milk, I think he's currently saying 3 times a week. Now, where are these dairy cattle going to come from? As many people would realise, dairy cattle aren't particularly suited to 31 degrees with 80 to 90% humidity. They don't tend to do too well. So CPC is one of the first organisations that is helping support this project by importing dairy cattle that can hopefully be bred up for this program. That's a lot of milk.
So sort of acclimatising them.
Well, the problem is it's all very much testing at the moment and trying to support it. It's certainly not going to be a financial boon to anybody who's involved in it at the moment. At the moment, they've got about 50 there in the feedlot. They were under very, very large fans, like multiple fans. The dairy cattle that were pregnant were in almost like a cool room environment. I think it will only ever be able to be done on a very small scale just because of the intensity of trying to keep these cattle in good condition and in cool enough conditions. It was quite interesting to see, very much a sideline, but I think CPC wanting to do the right thing and wanting to be seen to be doing the right thing is definitely trying this program with dairy cattle.
So where would most milk come from in Indonesia?
It'd be bought in. It's relatively expensive for many people.
So cow's milk would be largely imported?
I think so. There would be some available.
Probably just not a lot of use, not a lot of consumption compared to here.
And powdered milk probably too, probably coming in from some places, yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. I guess to sum up, Ken, what do you ultimately take away from this experience in relation to the Australian cattle industry?
That's something that I guess I continue to play around with in my head. What have I learnt? What is new? I think for me, my aim was to see how are Australian cattle treated when they arrive in Indonesia. And the short answer to that is very well, exceptionally well. I was very impressed the entire time with the whole process. Probably as a journalist, I was being shown, I guess, the best of the best, but at the same time, I was given access to have a look around, to ask questions. So I was very, very impressed. In fact, my quip that I say to people is, in some ways, Australian cattle are treated better than many of the people in terms of when you look at Indonesia, which is a developing nation and has many, many poor people. So, yes, that's what I learned. I think the interest for the cattle industry is to continue to, I guess, be aware that the political situation could change. At the moment, it hasn't, but it's very much imperative on the cattle industry to make sure that this continues to operate at this very, very high standard so that as perhaps the blowtorch is turned once again onto the cattle industry down the track, the live export industry, that they can look at a record and go, no, this is what we're doing and everything is top notch. So I think I learnt a lot. It was great for me to be in a country which is just so foreign, where, you know, you've got people on whole families on one motorbike carrying a wheelbarrow, and it's just extraordinary. And the noise of Jakarta and out in the village, just in the villages, just seeing the people going about their daily work and trying to make a living, whether it's by hand cutting corn or by hand turning over tapioca chips. It's an extraordinary experience and so different to what we generally see here in Australia.
Well, thank you for doing that for Outback, Ken.
It really was a pleasure. I have done many great assignments over the years, and to travel to somewhere like that on behalf of Outback was indeed a privilege.
It was really interesting to talk to you. I'm really looking forward to your story, which will be coming up in Outback soon, where, of course, people listening to this can read all about it and also see your great pictures. And I guess we'll probably throw in a couple of maps. And yes, you'll really summarise the experience very eloquently, I'm sure, Ken.
Thank you. Well, who knows? It's that mystery before you start writing, isn't it? How's this story going to come out?
Well, you might think it's a mystery. I never think it's a mystery how your stories are going to come out. They always come out very well, and you always write them so quickly. You put me to shame. Anyway, I should probably let you go and get on with that work. Thank you for being on the podcast today. I'm sure it's not the last time you will be.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks again, Ken, and thank you, listener, for sticking with us to this point of the podcast. Don't forget, Ken's story will be coming up in Outback soon. You can learn all about Outback at www.outbackmag.com.au. I will talk to you in the next podcast. Take care.